All right, diving in today, folks, we're going deep, deep into the mind of, well, I'd say a pretty major figure in the Cambridge Platonists, Henry More. He lived 1614 to 1687, so a while back. And we're using, really our main source here is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah, the FEPI, excellent resource. And what we're kind of trying to do is like zero in on the parts of his philosophical theology that would really grab like a philosopher, you
Yeah.
know. We're going to unpack his hardcore rationalism, his deep dives into like really heavy metaphysics and how he tackled the philosophical problems of his time, which were, pretty intense.
Yeah.
And the thing is, he was like super unique even among the Cambridge Platonists, who are already a pretty distinct bunch.
Right, right. Yeah, totally. Okay, so like, its starting point, like biographically, Henry More, born in Grantham, 1614,
Okay.
and then spent, it looks like, most of his academic life at Christ's College, Cambridge, after, Eton. And
Yeah.
early on, like, real strong attraction to Neoplatonism.
Yeah.
So, like, that's kind of where his philosophical roots are starting to grow, it seems like.
Yeah. You can really see that early phase in how his dualistic ideas develop. And it comes out in like even his philosophical poems like Psychodia Platonica, that's from 1642.
Okay.
And this wasn't just like dabbling in poetry. This was serious philosophical work, right? He's exploring the nature of the soul, the immortality of the soul.
Heavy stuff.
And he's going head to head with other views. Like he takes on the mortalist idea, which is, the belief that when you die, the soul just stops existing until the resurrection. And he addresses that in Anti-Psychopanikia.
Okay.
So he's already like engaging in these big debates.
And he also, like, really goes after the Everoistic concept of a single universal soul for, like, all of humanity. That's in his Anti-Monopsychia.
Yeah.
So even in his early poetry, he's staking out some pretty clear philosophical territory.
Oh, yeah.
This insistence on individual souls, like that's telling, right?
It is. It speaks volumes. And one of the things that seems to have really driven him in those early years was a deep rejection of Calvinist predestination. The idea of a God who's not perfectly good was just like unthinkable to him. He needed a theology that was like solid, rational.
It made sense.
Right. And so he sets out to demonstrate God's existence through the creation, through, what he saw as the best of all possible worlds, which, is an argument that becomes super central in his later works, like Immortality of the Soul and Divine Dialogues. The logic there is like, look, creation is obviously perfect, so atheism just doesn't hold up.
Right. Bold move, bold move. Now, the thing that struck me, and this epic kind of points this out too, is like he's using poetry for these, like, intense philosophical argument.
Yeah, that's pretty wild when you think about it.
They make these comparisons to Lucretius, even alchemical magical texts.
Yeah.
There's this tension, right, between like his rational mind and this deep religious feeling he has. What do you make of that?
I think that tension is key to More. It's like this internal push and pull. The SAP really brings this out. Doing philosophy in verse was just not the norm in academia back then. It suggests there was this dynamic between his like commitment to reason when it came to theology and this really powerful, almost mystical religious feeling.
Okay.
I mean, his biographer even said he was naturally inclined to enthusiasm, but it seems like he was like actively trying to control that. So maybe that explains why later on he moves more toward a systematic prose kind of approach.
Yeah. It's almost like he needed to kind of, to really rein himself in,
Exactly. Structure things a bit.
And you can see this need to like define where he stood philosophically, even in his, it was a pretty public argument he had with the alchemist Thomas Vaughan.
Oh, right. Yeah.
It was like he felt he had to distance himself from Vaughan's Neoplatonism and alchemy, even though, on the surface, they're both calling themselves Platonists. So what was the big deal there?
What's really interesting about that whole Vaughan episode is that it kind of foreshadows More's later idea of the spirit of nature.
Yep.
He was trying to carve out his own, like, very specific version of Platonism. And he really took issue with what he saw as Vaughan's idea that the world spirit was, like, fragmented into individual creatures. More's dualism, his very strict dualism, the separation of like immaterial souls and matter, it just couldn't handle that.
Yeah.
He's emphasizing that spirit is individual and active. It's not this like diffuse world soul kind of thing.
Gotcha. So even in defining what he wasn't, he's kind of becoming clearer about what he was philosophically.
Absolutely, sharpening his own ideas.
Now, a big turning point, it seems, is when Descartes hits the scene with his Principia Philosophiae. And More is, like, seriously impressed.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like, blown away. He saw Descartes as this, like, giant, head and shoulders above all the natural philosophers before him. He becomes like an early adopter of Cartesianism in Britain, really enthusiastic. I mean, some people even credit him with like coining the term Cartesianism and maybe even having some influence on the preface of the first English translation of Discourse on a Method. That's pretty significant.
Yeah, yeah, totally. But Seth's careful to point out, though, it wasn't like blind acceptance.
Right.
Moore had some big reservations about key parts of Cartesianism right from the beginning. It wasn't like a simple case of following the master and then like rebelling. It was more like this constant wrestling with Descartes' ideas through his own like well-established philosophical lens.
Yeah, that's a much more nuanced picture. It seems Moore genuinely believed he and Descartes were ultimately aiming for the same thing religiously,
Okay.
like establishing a mind-body dualism to back up religious belief,
Yes.
even if their philosophical methods were pretty different. Moore actually has this great line where he talks about their paths being like parallel but distinct. He says they start at the same point, but Descartes takes the lower road of democratism, through atoms and the void, while Moore climbs the high and airy hills of Platonism. But they end up meeting, he says, at the threshold of revealed theology, like in the Bible.
Interesting. Interesting.
It's a powerful way of seeing how he thought their philosophies converged, even though they were coming from different angles.
Yeah. Yeah. Great analogy. Great analogy. But when you look at their letters, they had some pretty fundamental disagreements.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We're talking core metaphysical stuff like what is space? What makes a body a body?
Absolutely. For Moore, he just couldn't buy into Descartes' distinction between an indefinite and an infinite universe. And he also rejected how Descartes defined a body simply as extension.
Right.
Which, if that's all a body is, then there's no room for a vacuum. And this is where Moore starts to lay out his own. And it's pretty unique, this view that everything, even immaterial stuff like God and souls, has to exist in space. It has to be expended. Like, for Moore, if something doesn't take up space, it just doesn't exist.
Right.
And that's a huge difference from how Descartes sees immaterial substances, that res cogitans, the thinking thing that's not spatial.
That's a huge difference. And this leads them to clash over Descartes' famous mind-body dualism, right?
Right.
Moore just wasn't satisfied with it. He had problems with how a non-physical mind could like actually interact with the physical body, the classic interaction problem.
Right.
And then there's Descartes' whole thing about animals not having souls. I mean, that was a real sticking point.
Yeah, huge point of contention. Moore believed that souls and God, these self-active immaterial things, they were the prime movers in a material world that's basically inert, which is the opposite of Descartes, who saw motion as just transferring mechanically between bodies.
Right.
And forget about the animal automaton theory. Yeah. That was a no-go for Moore. He saw animals and even plants to some extent moving on their own.
Yeah.
And that was proof of immaterial souls. Like for a philosopher who's all about agency and what makes life life, that Cartesian view just wouldn't cut it.
Yeah. Yeah. He even criticizes Descartes' account of colliding bodies. Moore thought it was too materialistic and could lead to like atheistic interpretations of nature.
Yeah, almost like he's constantly trying to protect that spiritual realm, making sure that purely mechanical explanations don't completely explain everything that's going on.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so this kind of leads us into his development of natural theology, his idea of the spirit of nature, which is pretty unique to him. And an antidote against atheism seems like a key early work here. He's trying to prove God's existence through studying the natural world, right?
Exactly. He wants a rational argument for God based on what we can observe. And it's considered a super important early work in British natural theology. He even uses this example of someone finding Archimedes' treatise, this super complex design, implies a designer.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost like a precursor to Paley's watchmaker analogy,
Right.
And to build his case for this immaterial realm and the need for spirit to explain why things happen spontaneously, he throws everything at it, like Descartes' ontological proof, the idea of innate ideas, the teleological argument, even stories about witchcraft and stuff.
Yeah, covering all the bases. Then we have Conjectura Cabalistica, which sounds like a pretty interesting attempt to blend a natural philosophy with revealed religion.
Yeah.
The whole idea that Cartesianism lines up with some Mosaic philosophy from Pythagoreanism. That's a pretty big claim.
It is a big claim.
For a philosopher who's all about reason, it seems like kind of a weird turn.
Well, the title makes it sound like he's deep into Jewish Kabbalah, But the Sapal actually says it leans more in Christian Kabbalah, like from the Renaissance.
Okay.
He's looking for parallels between Descartes' three types of matter and the soul's three vehicles, like in esoteric traditions. The connection to actual Jewish Kabbalah is kind of limited. It's more like he's tapping into this trend at the time to find ancient wisdom that backs up the latest philosophical and scientific ideas.
Gotcha, gotcha. So it's more about like the spirit of the thing,
Yeah, exactly. Riding that intellectual wave.
Then he tackles religious fanaticism in Enthusiasmus Triumphatus, again, big on separating matter and spirit, and criticizing pantheism for blurring those lines. This separation, it's like his obsession, like the foundation of his whole system, it seems like.
Oh, absolutely. It's fundamental. And then all these threads kind of come together in the immortality of the soul. He's taking on Hobbes' head-on materialism, determinism, and the idea that the soul dies with the body. And this is where his spirit of nature concept gets fully fleshed out. For a philosopher dealing with the rise of materialism, this idea becomes super important.
Okay, so let's dig into this spirit of nature. This is More's, like, big idea, the one everyone talks about and debates. What is it and what problem is he trying to solve?
All right, so the spirit of nature in More's world is this immaterial substance, but it's extended in space everywhere.
Okay.
Think of it like God's deputy, this vicarious power that explains the stuff that a purely mechanical view of the universe just can't handle. Like gravity, magnetism, even how things grow and develop. For a philosopher who's trying to explain the whole cosmos, it's clear that just mechanics isn't enough.
So it's like God delegates this power to handle the stuff that plain old matter can't do on its own. Is he trying to, like, avoid God having to constantly intervene?
That's a great way to put it. Moore argues that, sure, matter itself, once moved, can move other matter, but it can't start moving on its own.
Right, right.
And it can't explain all the patterns and complexity we see in nature. The fact that matter can stop moving means there's got to be something else, something spiritual and active making things happen. He sees the spirit of nature as this emanative cause, like light from a lamp. It creates effects just by being there and doing its thing. Like he says famously, something must move itself.
Yeah.
This is him tackling a fundamental problem. Where does motion come from in a universe that's supposed to be, like, basically just dead matter?
Right, right, right. And crucially, this spirit of nature is spread out in space. That's a big difference from Descartes' res cogitans.
Okay.
Right? For More, existing and taking up space go hand in hand.
You got it.
So how does he explain this extended but also immaterial substance?
So to deal with the seeming contradiction, he comes up with this concept of discernibility.
Okay.
Basically, immaterial stuff can't be physically split apart. He uses light, again, as an analogy, like you can't chop a light beam in half. Even space itself, for More, is an example of something extended but indivisible. This is at the heart of its metaphysics. To exist means to be present in space, even if you're not material.
Gotcha, gotcha.
Yeah.
But if this spirit of nature is doing so much, isn't that introducing, like, a second cause? Does that mean God isn't directly involved? How does he square that with his theology?
He's very clear that the spirit of nature is like a secondary or emanatory substance. It works blindly, no consciousness or smarts. It's not meant to replace God acting directly. He uses this example of an air pump. The air moves and does stuff, but doesn't have, like, knowledge or intentions. He saw the spirit of nature as the way God's laws get transmitted and put into action. It's like a mute copy of the eternal word, carrying out God's will, but not acting on its own.
So it's how he explains the order in nature without God constantly stepping in and tweaking things.
Exactly.
He's finding a balance between a God-run universe and this new understanding of natural laws. But the Seppi mentions that later, he seems to question even pure mechanical interactions. Like, how did that develop?
Yeah, so later on, he gets even more skeptical of the mechanical philosophy. He starts saying, like, there is no phenomenon of nature purely mechanical. There's this principle acting for the best that's behind everything in nature. The spirit of nature's role seems to get even bigger in his later writings, like it's even more pervasive. It shows how he's moving away from purely material explanations and leaning more into the idea that things have a purpose.
Okay. Now, shifting gears a bit to ethics and theology, he writes Enchiridion Ethicum in 1667.
Right.
And he lays out this absolutist ethic, saying good and evil are objective, they exist on their own, separate from God's will. This seems to connect to his necessitarian theology, the idea that even God has to play by the rules of these moral principles. So what does that mean for God's freedom?
Yeah, this was him directly challenging the Calvinist view of God's will being the only thing that determines what's good. Moore thought God, because he's perfectly good, is bound by these eternal, unchanging moral truths. Like God's own nature forces him to follow them and to create the best possible world.
Okay.
He explores this more in Divine Dialogues, emphasizing how infinitely good, wise, and powerful God is, and how it just makes sense that God always does what's best, even when things in nature seem at first glance kind of bad, like animals that cause harm.
Right, right. And then comes Enchiridion Metaphysicum, where he recaps his main ideas and introduces this idea of absolute infinite space as the ultimate example of an immaterial spirit.
Yeah.
It's like he's making space this huge metaphysical principle.
It's a major move. He spends a lot of time arguing for real, self-existing, infinite, three-dimensional Euclidean space, like the kind Newton would later become famous for.
Okay.
But Moore doesn't see space as just emptiness. It's the best example of something that's real but not material, because, like he says, it's so imaginary that it cannot be disimagined. You can't think it away.
Hmm.
For a philosopher who's looking for proof of the immaterial, space is a pretty good candidate.
Yeah.
Yeah. The SEP highlights this argument he makes that for finite material things to exist, there has to be something else that's extended and separate from matter, and that's space.
Exactly.
And then he goes even further, drawing all these parallels between this absolute space and God. He even lists all these qualities of God that he thinks also fit space.
Right.
That's a pretty bold and unusual theological claim.
Yeah, definitely bold. He sees space as God's main tool, like an organ that he uses to create and sustain the universe. It's essential for anything to be created.
Okay.
He even suggests that God himself is extended and infinite, and that space is like something that flows from God's being. It's a result of God being infinite.
Right.
And this goes against Descartes' view of souls being non-spatial, which Moore calls nullibism.
Hmm.
He also rejects the traditional Holland-Marianism, where the soul is completely present in every part of the body. He thinks that messes up the whole relationship between existing and taking up space.
So for Moore, it's not about extended matter versus non-extended spirit, but about body being impenetrable and discernible versus spirit being penetrable and indiscernible.
Exactly.
They both exist within this absolute space. And he makes a similar argument for time, saying absolute duration is real and necessary, also an attribute of God.
Yeah, he's trying to fit God's eternal nature with our experience of time, suggesting that God is present at every point in eternity all at once.
Right.
Which is a more common view compared to his super new ideas about God being extended in space.
Now, with ideas this out there, it's no surprise that Moore got some pushback, especially about the spirit of nature.
Oh, yeah. He got a lot of that.
The essay mentions big names like Boyle, Hooke, and Hale. They saw it as unnecessary and lacking proof. What were their main arguments against it?
Well, Boyle, in particular, thought Moore was adding all this complexity when simpler mechanical explanations work just fine.
Right.
It's funny because Moore actually used some of Boyle's own experiments to back up the spirit of nature, and Boyle wasn't having it.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Even within his circle, people started moving in different directions. Like Lady Conway, who was his student at one point, ends up going for this monistic philosophy, the opposite of Moore's dualism. And John Finch, who was also a fan early on, swings toward materialism and empiricism, also not on board with Moore's spiritual stuff.
It's wild how even people close to him end up branching off. And his whole thing with Kabbalah, he thought he'd find support for his ideas there, but it didn't really work out, huh?
Yeah, it's kind of ironic. He thought he'd find this historical and maybe mystical backing in Jewish Kabbalah, but he got kind of disappointed. It was too mystical for him. And he thought it leaned towards monism, which clashed with his dualism. And get this, the main Christian Kabbalist of the time actually published Moore's critiques of Kabbalah.
Wow.
So not exactly the endorsement he was hoping for.
Right, right. And then toward the end of his life, he's in these debates with big thinkers like Spinoza and Glisson, defending his dualism against their Monism and Hylosoism.
Yeah, constant intellectual battles.
Right.
He saw their ideas as fundamentally challenging his whole system.
He thought Spinoza's monism was basically atheism, and he strongly disagreed with Glisson's idea that all matter is alive and aware. And then there was this exchange with Richard Baxter, who was coming from a Calvinist perspective.
Right.
He took issue with Moore's necessitarian theology and his insistence that matter is passive. These debates show just how much intellectual activity was going on then, and Moore was right in the middle of it.
Yeah, he was a real fighter. It's interesting, though, because the SB says that Moore's reputation actually got better after he died, especially in the early 1700s. Why do you think his ideas caught on more with later generations?
It's a good question. I think his mix of rationalism and faith really resonated with the early Enlightenment, a time when people were grappling with Newtonian physics and the rise of deism.
Hmm.
He was seen as important in the development of early latitudinarianism, a more moderate, rational version of Anglicanism.
And his necessitarian theology also gained some followers. There's even some thought that he might have indirectly influenced Hobbes's later idea of a corporeal God, but that's still up for debate.
And of course, there's the possible influence on Isaac Newton, one of the giants of the scientific revolution,
Right.
especially when it comes to absolute space and time. How direct was that connection?
Well, there's no doubt Newton knew More's work, and there are definite similarities in how they both saw absolute space and time and their link to God. Like, they both thought of space as, in a way, flowing from God's being. But it's important to remember that Newton wasn't just a More fanboy.
Right.
He didn't buy into More's spirit of nature, and they had different theological views.
Okay.
But More's articulation of absolute space likely helped shape Newton's own ideas.
So even with all the controversy and criticism, it's clear from the essay that Henry Moore is a big deal in the history of science, philosophy, and how they relate to each other. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for a philosophical mind when it comes to Moore's philosophical theology?
I think what you see in Moore is a really powerful, even if it's a bit idiosyncratic, effort to build a completely rational basis for religious belief. And this is happening during a time of huge change, both intellectually and scientifically. His dualism, with that sharp line between matter and spirit, his unique and influential concept of the spirit of nature acting as God's agent in the world, and his big contributions to understanding absolute space and time in relation to God, those are all key.
Right.
What's really striking is how he tackled the challenges of materialism and atheism head-on. He built a philosophical system drawing on Plato, but also actively engaging with the latest advances in mechanical philosophy.
Yeah.
His work is this fascinating attempt to bring faith and reason together in a world where ideas were changing super
It
fast.
was a big project, for sure, even if not everyone agreed with him. So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Moore was totally dedicated to using the latest philosophical and scientific ideas to support his theology. What are the parallels today in the conversation between science, philosophy, and religion? How do our modern understandings of the universe, like quantum mechanics, cosmology, all that, challenge or maybe even support Moore's search for a rational faith?
That's definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
And for those who want to explore more of this fascinating history, I highly recommend checking out the other Cambridge Platonists, the development of natural theology, and those early arguments about space and time.
Right. Tons to discover.
It's a rich vein of intellectual history.
All right, folks. Well, that's our deep dive for today. Until next time.
See you then.